right, welcome to section 7-1, Life is Cellular. So now we're going to start talking about the cell. A lot of this is going to be a review from what you learned in 8th grade. So we're going to move through this kind of quickly. The invention of the microscope was the key to the discovery of the cell. And we're going to talk about, in this particular section, who were the main players when it talked about the discovery of the cell. So the first person that you need to make sure that you are aware of is Robert Hooke. That's the first guy, the number one guy that you have to remember. Robert Hooke used an early compound microscope to look at a thin cork slice. One thing that you have to remember is that cork is a plant, not an animal. Cork comes from a tree, and a compound microscope has two lenses. Two lenses. That's a compound microscope. So once again, he looked at a thin cork slice. He realized that that cork was made of thousands of tiny empty chambers, and that's why he called them cells, because they reminded him of the monastery's tiny rooms. And a monastery is where monks live. Player number 2 is Anton van Leeuwenhoek. He used a single lens, so a different one, a single lens microscope to observe pond water. And of course, pond water, that means van Leeuwenhoek saw living things. And there it is. He observed a world of tiny living organisms that seemed to be everywhere. So Hooke looked at a cork cell, or a slice of cork, which was a dead plant cell. Van Leeuwenhoek looked at living things. The next two players are from Germany. The first one is a German botanist called Matthias Schleiden, and he concluded that all plants were made of cells. Person number 4 that you have to remember is a German biologist who was Theodor Schwann, and he stated that all animals were made of cells. All right, so now you have 4 people: Hooke, van Leeuwenhoek, Schleiden, and Schwann. How do you distinguish, especially between Schleiden and Schwann? Well, here's how I do it. Schwann, think of swan. The reason is Schwann is because if you think of the Schwann's truck that drives around the city and delivers all of the frozen food off of it, it has a swan on the outside of the truck. And a swan is an animal. So that's how I have always remembered the difference between Schleiden and Schwann. Schwann is the animal guy, which means Schleiden is the plant guy. And the last one is German physician Rudolf Virchow. And he concluded that new cells could only be produced from the division of existing cells. So those are the 5 guys that you have to remember: Hooke, van Leeuwenhoek, Schleiden, Schwann, and Virchow. They came up with what is called the cell theory. There are 3 parts to the cell theory. Part number 1, all living things are composed of cells. Part number 2, cells are the basic units of structure and function in all living things. And part number 3, new cells are produced from existing cells, which means cells come from cells. There is no spontaneous generation of an organism. In order to have a new cell, it has to come from an existing cell. So once again, these 3 parts are very important when it comes to the development of the cell theory. And those 5 guys were responsible for this information. Hook, Van Leeuwenhoek, Schleiden, Schwann, and Virchow. Cells come in a great variety of shapes and amazing range of sizes. And of course, when we do our lab in school, we can see things by using a light microscope. So these are the organisms in this particular range that we are capable of seeing at school with the microscopes that we have in the back of the room. An electron microscope can see things much smaller, and we do not have that type of microscope here at Craig High School. We use a light microscope. Most cells are relatively small because as size increases, volume increases much more rapidly. Cells range from 5 to 50 micrometers in diameter, with the smallest being about 0.2 micrometers across. And once again, they are extremely small and they cannot be viewed with the naked eye. You do need a microscope in order to see cells. All cells have two characteristics in common. First, they are surrounded by a barrier called a cell membrane. One thing that you're going to find out is the cell membrane, again, is for all types of cells. Whether they are plant or animal cells, they all have a cell membrane. They contain the molecule that carries genetic information, or DNA. And we just learned about DNA in the previous chapter. DNA is a nucleic acid. Sometimes when you're doing some of your worksheets, sometimes the cell membrane is also called the plasma membrane. So these two terms coincide with one another. So if you hear them talk about the plasma membrane, that also means the cell membrane. Cells fall into two categories depending upon whether they contain a nucleus or not. The nucleus is a large membrane-enclosed structure that contains the cell's genetic material in the form of DNA. So the nucleus is at the center of all cells. The two types of cells are prokaryotes. Prokaryotes, the genetic material is not contained in the nucleus. And once again, this is extremely important. The genetic material is not contained in a nucleus. As you can see in the picture, it is this strand, and it's a single thread that has no beginning. It's connected in the center of that particular cell. They are smaller and simpler than eukaryotic cells, which we're going to talk about next, and they carry out every activity associated with living things. They grow, they reproduce, they respond. Some examples of prokaryotes would be bacteria. So all bacteria are prokaryotes, which means their genetic material is not contained within a nucleus. Eukaryotes, on the other hand, the genetic material is contained within a nucleus. So that's the difference between the two types of cells. And the nucleus is separated from the rest of the cell. So if you look at the picture here, the nucleus looks like this golf ball type of thing, which is located in the center of the cell. Eukaryotic cells are extremely specialized, and they contain dozens of structures and internal membranes, which we will go into further discussion later on in the week. Examples of organisms that are made up of eukaryotic cells are protists, fungi, plants, and animals. So once again, eukaryotes have their genetic material contained within a nucleus and is separated from the rest of the cell. All right, I'm just going to leave this up here. These are just a review of different processes that the cell, as well as our bodies, go through, because you have to think of a cell as a miniature large organism. It does all of the functions and it has all the parts and pieces that we do, except on a much smaller scale. So just copy these down in your notes, and you'll be using or hearing about these particular processes later on. So nutrition, which means all cells need food in order to supply energy and to build materials. All cells have a way of breaking down that food, which is called digestion, into simpler forms. All cells have to have a way to absorb or take in water, food, ions, and other materials from the environment. And all cells have to get rid of waste products. So once again, if you think about us as living organisms, as big ones, we need to eat. We need to break down what we eat. We have to have a way to absorb that into our system so that we can use it for energy, and we need to get rid of waste. Cells go through the same processes that we do. Finally, these are the next 5. Biosynthesis. Bio is life. Synthesis means to make. So in biosynthesis, cells make organic molecules like carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Respiration. This is not breathing. Breathing is letting oxygen go in and out of your lungs. Respiration is the release of energy from food. Food burns oxygen and gives off carbon dioxide. So that is how we use energy. Secretion. Vitamins and hormones are made by special cells. Response. Just like we respond to things in the environment, cells can change due to stimuli such as heat, light, or pressure, which we're going to talk about in future lectures. And finally, all cells need to be able to reproduce, because the cell theory said new cells have to come from existing cells. So cell division is a way that the cells increase the number of cells to either carry on life or to grow. And once again, we will talk about all of these processes in more detail as we're working through the cell unit. That concludes section 7-1.